When Russia sent drones into Poland, it crossed a line. For the first time since it invaded Ukraine, Russia's drones had gone beyond Ukrainian airspace and into that of a NATO member. Poland was furious. It should be, because Vladimir Putin is pushing buttons and testing responses, perhaps with a view to launching a full-scale war against NATO in the future. Enough is enough, Poland roars. Poland slaps Putin with a demand that Russia's leader never expected. It's time for NATO to close the sky on Russia by implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. On September 15th, the Washington Post reported on comments made by Poland's Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski. In an interview with the German news outlet Frankfurter Allgemeine, Sikorski claimed that it was about time that NATO did something about the massive long-range drone threat Russia presents, not only to Ukraine, but to all of Europe. We as NATO and the EU could be capable of doing this, but it's not a decision that Poland can make alone. It can only be made with its allies, Sikorski told the German outlet. Protection for our population, for example, from falling debris, would naturally be greater if we could combat drones and other flying objects beyond our national territory. Sikorski hasn't flat out said that a no-fly zone should be implemented. However, the implication is clearly there in the hypothetical he creates. And Sikorski is right. From the NATO perspective, having the ability to shoot Russian drones down over the skies of Ukraine could protect those countries outside of Ukraine that Russia now seems to be intent on targeting. Sikorski continued, stating, "If Ukraine were to ask us to shoot them down over its territory, that would be advantageous for us. If you ask me personally, we should consider it." Note the mention of only implementing a no-fly zone if Ukraine asks. That's an important point because Sikorski realizes that it's not just NATO taking a risk if a no-fly zone is implemented. NATO missiles and other air defenses flying across the border into Ukraine create the potential for accidents to happen, meaning any no-fly zone that's created would have to be the result of a coordinated effort between Ukraine and NATO. Would Ukraine say yes to this sort of proposal? We'll reveal the answer to that later in the video. Right now, you may be wondering why nobody has come up with this sort of idea before. Surely NATO allies taking out Russian drones and missiles inside Ukraine is such a good idea that Poland's allies will jump all over the opportunity, right? Unfortunately, no. The idea of creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine has been floated several times since Russia launched its invasion, with every suggestion of it happening being met with a flat refusal. There are several reasons why, with the Washington Post noting that NATO hasn't wanted to take this step in the past because of the risk of NATO aircraft entering into direct combat with Russian aircraft. That may have been more of a risk during the early months of the war, when Russia was sending its aircraft into Ukraine. Now, however, Russia is relying on a drone-centric strategy, with its manned aircraft mostly being relegated to launching missiles and glide bombs at Ukraine from far behind the front lines. Perhaps this reason for saying no in the past isn't reason enough to repeat that response today. Both the BBC and the UK's House of Commons revealed that the suggestion of a no-fly zone was being made within weeks of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In a March 2022 post by the House of Commons Library, the UK's Parliament detailed exactly what would be involved in creating a no-fly zone in the first place. The idea is to deny the use of airspace to enemy aircraft, which can involve monitoring that airspace, maintaining surveillance aircraft to observe threats and, where necessary, deploying combat measures such as fighter jets and missiles to shoot down any enemy aircraft that enter the no-fly zone. However, and this is the big point, a no-fly zone needs to have a legal basis before it can be implemented. The House of Commons Library says that 3 conditions need to be met. First, any no-fly zone has to be authorized by the United Nations Security Council. That creates an immediate problem for Sikorski's suggestion. Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of that very council, and it holds a veto power that means it could stop any proposal for a no-fly zone over Ukraine in its tracks. Poland, along with NATO and Ukraine, would likely have to find a way to kick Russia off the UN Security Council before it could overcome this legal hurdle. Right now, there is no mechanism to make that happen. Whether the UN will be willing to create one in the face of Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine is a massive question for which we don't have an answer. Assuming that the proposal for a no-fly zone over Ukraine is somehow accepted by the UN Security Council, there are 2 other hurdles to overcome. Any no-fly zone has to be established on the principle of individual or collective defense per Article 51 of the UN Charter. In other words, a country can't establish a no-fly zone without having the defense of its airspace from an imminent or occurring threat as a factor. This article prevents countries from simply not allowing aircraft from other nations to use their airspace due to spats or geopolitical wrangling where no imminent threat is involved. The Ukraine war means that this second legal barrier wouldn't be an issue. And finally, a no-fly zone can only be established with the consent of the state over which the no-fly zone is going to be implemented. Again, we'll tell you later in the video whether Ukraine is for or against Poland's proposal to create one of these zones over its territory. The BBC adds that creating a no-fly zone is just the first step. Even if all the legal barriers are overcome, that no-fly zone has to be enforced, which means committing aircraft, air defenses, and a lot of personnel to keep the skies over Ukraine clear. As former US Air Force General Philip Breedlove aptly puts it, you don't just say, that's a no-fly zone, you have to enforce a no-fly zone. This isn't to say that no-fly zones haven't worked in the past. The US and its coalition partners were able to create 2 of them in Iraq during the height of the First Gulf War. Interestingly, this was done without the UN's backing, suggesting that it is possible to circumvent the first legal hurdle we mentioned earlier. Another no-fly zone was created over Bosnian airspace during the Balkans conflict in 1992, with this one being created with the UN's backing, as was the no-fly zone created over Libya in 2011. In both of those cases, the zones were enforced by NATO forces, meaning the organization that would benefit most from a no-fly zone over Ukraine would also be the one enforcing that no-fly zone. The only 2 things that are certain here are that the idea of a no-fly zone has been suggested and refused before, and that implementing one would be challenging from a legal perspective. But let's assume the legalities aren't a problem for a moment. Has something happened that could change NATO's past perspective on no-fly zones over Ukraine beyond Russia's switch to using drones in Ukraine instead of traditional manned aircraft? It has. And that something may be enough to make NATO reconsider its previous stance on a Ukrainian no-fly zone. On September 10th, Poland was forced to shoot down suspected Russian drones in its airspace. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk labeled the event the closest we have been to open conflict since World War II, though he immediately went on to say that there was no reason to believe that Poland was on the brink of a war with Russia. Still, what happened on September 10th was unprecedented. For the first time since Putin launched his invasion, Russian drones had gone beyond Ukraine's border and into the airspace of a NATO member. Poland and its NATO allies responded to those Russian drones quickly, Reuters reports. Poland scrambled F-16 fighter jets, with the Dutch sending F-35s into the skies. Italy deployed an AWACS surveillance aircraft, and a NATO-operated refueling tanker was also deployed to ensure all of these other aircraft could stay in the skies for as long as they needed to. Once the dust had settled, Poland reported that there appeared to be 19 drones that entered its airspace, at least 3 of which were shot down. The Washington Post says that it now seems that all of the drones were unarmed decoys, though debris from one of them still smashed into a pensioner's home. Tomasz Wesolowski's roof was destroyed, with debris being flung all over his bedroom. Fortunately, Wesolowski was downstairs watching the news, which was ironically covering the drone incursion at the time. Responses to the incident were immediate and varied. Russia, of course, denied that it was behind the attack, with a Russian diplomat in Poland emphasizing that the drones had come from the direction of Ukraine. Of course they had. Russian drones would have to pass through Ukraine to strike Poland. This is hardly a defense, given that Russian drones are launched into Ukrainian airspace almost daily. Poland almost immediately requested a meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss the issue, and several NATO allies committed to helping Poland. The Czech Republic and the Netherlands have already said they'll send defenses, with Germany claiming that it will intensify its engagement along NATO's eastern border. A trio of Rafale fighter jets will also arrive in Poland, courtesy of France. The US was a little slower to respond, with President Donald Trump simply stating, "What's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones? Here we go," in a Truth Social post. No other US action appears to have been announced yet, but it seems like Trump is exasperated with Russia's continued pushing of NATO's buttons. And that's the point. Many now see Russia sending drones into Poland as a Russian test of the NATO response to what, for all intents and purposes, was a direct attack on the territory of a NATO member. Sikorsky is among them. On September 15th, The Guardian reported on comments made by Sikorsky about Russia's drone attack. The Polish foreign minister confirmed that Russia's drones weren't loaded with explosives, though he said they were capable of carrying ammunition. Interestingly, they were all duds, which suggests to me that Russia tried to test us out without starting a war, Sikorsky said. And Russia keeps on trying to test NATO. Just a few days after the reports of Russia's drones entering Poland's airspace broke, Russia was at it again. This time it was Romania that was the target. Another NATO member, Romania, said that a Russian drone had breached its airspace on September 14th. Romania already had its fighter jets in the skies as they were monitoring a Russian drone assault on Ukraine that was ongoing at the time. One of the Russian drones split from the pack and entered Romania, with the jets tracking it 12.4 miles southwest of the village of Chileveche before it fell off the radar. This drone was a Geran. That's the Russian name for its version of the Iranian Shahid 136, which Russia has been building domestically for several years. Fortunately, the Russian drone didn't fly over any populated areas or pose a threat to civilians, Romania says. But as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky puts it, this was an obvious expansion of the war by Russia, and it couldn't have been a mistake. In the space of a week, Russian drones entered the airspace of 2 NATO members. That has changed the game when it comes to creating a no-fly zone. Beyond the reasons for not creating one that we've already discussed, the unspoken reason for not creating one of these zones in Ukraine is that Ukraine isn't a NATO member. As long as Russia's drones stayed in Ukraine, NATO wasn't under threat. Now it is. And the idea of shooting down Russia's drones before they ever fly over NATO borders has suddenly become a lot more palatable. A few NATO nations have already started creating something similar to no-fly zones on their territory, with Poland being among them. On September 1st, Politico reported that Poland, along with Latvia, put sweeping restrictions into effect on their airspace, with those restrictions essentially halting civilian flights along their eastern borders. Poland's restrictions went into effect at 10 p.m. on September 10th and will last until December 9th. Latvia put its restrictions into effect a day later, though it says that they'll only last until September 18th. So Poland and Latvia are exercising more control over their airspace. But these aren't true no-fly zones. Neither country is about to start shooting down civilian planes that enter this restricted space. If anything, the restrictions will protect those types of planes by ensuring that they don't run the risk of running into any of Russia's drones. As for a true no-fly zone over Ukraine, plenty of questions need to be asked, starting with the most obvious one. What would this zone look like? If we assume that all of the legal barriers and NATO hand-wringing disappear and a no-fly zone is put into place over Ukraine, New Sky says that the active participation of NATO aviation and air defense would be a must to enforce that zone with any degree of effectiveness. The implementation of a no-fly zone technically means the active participation of NATO aviation and air defense, patrolling Ukrainian airspace, constant radar control, readiness to shoot down not only drones but also Russian missiles or aircraft, the outlet claims. Furthermore, NATO might have to take a layered approach to a no-fly zone. After all, it's not just Kyiv and the cities close to Poland's border that are under threat of drone strikes. A no-fly zone over Ukraine would have to be a complex system that offers passage to every non-occupied portion of the country if the goal is to minimize the effectiveness of Russia's drones. Assuming NATO doesn't want to go that far, partial zones, likely focused on northern and western Ukraine, could be an option. New Sky says that several countries, including the UK, Turkey, France, and the US, are discussing these types of zones and create an air defense chain that serves as a buffer against Russia's drones. The Atlantic Council builds on these concepts in a September 16th article. It notes that one of the major challenges faced in creating any sort of no-fly zone is the risk of a direct confrontation between NATO and Russian aircraft, as we mentioned earlier. A single downed NATO aircraft over Ukraine or a destroyed anti-aircraft system on Russian territory could plunge Europe into a major crisis with unpredictable outcomes for international security, the Council points out. These types of threats could be mitigated, though perhaps at the cost of effectiveness. Europe's NATO members could rule out deploying fighter jets into Ukraine's airspace, for instance. This scenario would require the donation of more ground-based air defense systems to Ukraine, essentially allowing the country to create its own no-fly zone. But it would also mean that Russia's jets would have to enter NATO airspace if Putin wanted direct conflict. NATO nations contributing to Ukraine's growing army of interceptor drones could also be an option, though again, this would leave control of a no-fly zone in Ukrainian hands, rather than presenting the NATO threat that Sikorsky seems to be suggesting needs to be in place. It's in all of this uncertainty that we start to see the issue with a no-fly zone over Ukraine. No-fly zones are challenging to implement, even after stripping away all of the legal requirements. Furthermore, any no-fly zone would have to confront the threat posed by Russia's drones, which NATO's aerial might may not be fully equipped to do. As the New York Times puts it, the nature of the Russian threat has changed, as the Kremlin now relies on mass production of long-range drones instead of fighter jets streaking through the skies. NATO likely won't want to expend missiles that cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, to take out Russian drones that cost a fraction of that amount. But something has to be done about that drone threat. Russia has significantly boosted the production of the types of drones that entered Polish and Romanian airspace earlier in September. TSN says that Russia is now building 5,000 long-range drones per month, which is 5 times the amount it was making in 2024. Business Insider adds that Russia might be aiming for production at a scale that would allow it to launch 2,000 drones at Ukraine in a single night, with a vague target of November 2025 in place for that goal to be reached. Given all of this, reinforcing Ukraine's existing anti-drone defenses might indeed be the better option. The alternative is that NATO will either have to develop or further invest in air defense technology that tackles drones, or risk its fighter jets to take out targets that are far less valuable. There's also the risk that any NATO attempt to close Ukraine's skies could be seen as a direct act of war. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Medvedev has already made that implication, News Sky says, and Russia is supposedly already saying that it will shoot down any NATO aircraft that enter Ukraine. This is rhetoric of the type we've seen from Russia many times before, but it's also true that the type of no-fly zone that Sikorsky suggests would be a further escalation of the tensions between Russia and NATO. Perhaps that's what Putin wanted. Maybe Russia launched a handful of its drones into Poland, not to do any damage, but to prompt the sort of response that the Kremlin propagandists can paint as an act of aggression by the West. Just like that, Putin would have the justification for the war against NATO that he seems to want, meaning any NATO ally that considers taking part in a no-fly zone has to think long and hard about what that participation could really mean. And so we come to the final question we need to ask. It's a question we posed earlier in the video, and the answer would eliminate one of the 3 legal blockades we mentioned earlier. Will Ukraine consent to a no-fly zone? The emphatic answer is yes, to the point that Ukraine has expressed its willingness to cooperate with the creation of a no-fly zone almost since the beginning of Putin's invasion. According to the Washington Post, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the following in a video addressed to the US Congress in March 2022. To establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine is to save people. Humanitarian no-fly zone. Conditions under which Russia will no longer be able to terrorize our peaceful cities every day and night. Ukraine is willing to welcome almost any proposal that involves protecting its skies, which have been one of its major vulnerabilities throughout the war with Russia. Putin may be relying more on drones than missiles these days, but Ukraine still needs the defenses to take those drones down. A no-fly zone might provide those defenses. But a lot of hurdles, not least of which is NATO's reluctance, need to be overcome before Sikorsky's vision can be made into a reality. As the debate once again restarts over a Ukrainian no-fly zone, Vladimir Putin is doing everything that he can to shore up Russia's air defenses. Putin is getting desperate. He's begging Turkey for air defenses after Ukraine obliterated everything that Russia already has. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the ongoing conflict between NATO and Russia. And thank you for watching.